There are many things that inform us about our humanity, about what it is to be human and what we should and shouldn't do with the human form. One of the key elements in this is always faith. Now, in the West, and here we're focusing on the West, the human form is inexorably linked with the ideas of religion. Of course, when considering the eternal soul and the spiritual, we imagine these things through a human lens. It's only natural. If you imagine them through a squirrel lens, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. The result is that human forms pepper religious art throughout the world. You can hardly walk into a church without being confronted by the human form. Now here, we're going to be focusing primarily on the human form as it interacts with faith, primarily Christianity, because we're focusing in the West. If I were to make this much broader, this would be a far longer lecture because we would have to go through numerous non-Western cultures. Keep in mind, 85% of the world would qualify as non-Western. So here, we're focusing on the Western world. And in terms of questions, there are some things that we have to ask, or that I want to focus on. First of all, why do we depict ourselves so regularly in the images of our faith? Second, how has faith informed how we see ourselves? And finally, how do these religious images reflect the faith and societies that created them? My goal here is to examine the human form through the frame of religion, which is a prominent theme throughout human history. And we start by looking at idealization in religious art. The development of gods meant we as humans needed to work out how to depict them. In the pre-Greek world, that often meant adding animal features to the human form, from feline figure with a feline head to images of Anubis or even Horus. By Egypt, when the figure is human, such as the pharaoh, the rules dictated something wholly different. The pharaoh, for example, was understood to be a god, the physical form of Horus on earth. Consequently, they would idealize that physical form. And this will set a precedent for the Greeks. So it's the Egyptians that give us the idea of idealization because the pharaoh is a god. And we always think of gods in terms of perfection, which is why the pharaoh looks like an Abercrombie model, even though he would have never done any physical labor or done his 5x5 squats. For the Greeks, the gods were human, and the human figure was the most perfect form. It only follows that they would idealize the image of their gods in service to that god. No pressure there. Let's talk about sculpting gods. Now, the Greeks were known for their idealized form of men, especially during the classical period. Here, in a bit of a twist, we see idealized or increasingly idealized female forms. Why? Well, they're gods or goddesses to be more precise. The east pediment of the Parthenon showed the miraculous birth of the goddess Athena from the skull of her father Zeus. And we will focus here on the right. Here we see some of the witnesses to the event who we believe to be, from the left, Hestia, Diana, and reclining prominently, Aphrodite, although other interpretations do exist. Aphrodite's right shoulder is exposed. The heads, hands, and feet are, of course, missing. Looking at the figure, one could argue that it may be idealized, although idealized is kind of a problematic term here, because in the Greek world you do not idealize the female form unless they are a goddess. Females are lesser than males in the ancient Greek world. So what's happening here is they are idealizing her for a specific purpose. Aphrodite as goddess of fertility. This is goddess of reproduction. And so when you look at the idealization, it's focusing on the belly and the breasts, things that are necessary for reproduction and for feeding the child after birth until they can be weaned onto solid food. And what they're doing, this figure is depicting for us the Greek idea of feminine beauty, albeit clothed as was the style for the time. The cloth, what appears to be yards of wet silk, both covers and is meant to amplify the form. The sculptor is using the cloth in part because it's necessary, the modesty of the Greek world when it came to women, but also to show off his skill, the fact that he can depict a form underneath the cloth. This, and here's a recreation of course, is not a woman, nor really a goddess, but rather would have been intended as a personification of Plato's idea of beauty, both human yet somehow unreachable and unobtainable. Of course, idealizing a god only makes sense, even when depicted as human. However, this model of depicting gods relies on polytheistic beliefs, but will change during the Roman period with the advent of text-based Eastern cults. We're going to see a major change in faith. Now, a number of fundamental changes will occur between the state religion of Rome and Christianity. Western religion before Judeo-Christian faiths and Zoroastrianism focused primarily on community building. Festivals and practices focused on identity with the god and the state. So you would have these annual festivals, and the entire purpose of the festival was to identify you as a follower of a god and a member of a community. It's not about morals and ethics in any way, shape, or form. The Greeks are not concerned about such things in terms of their religion. Morals and ethics, of course, comes from philosophers and from the state, not from the gods. However, with the rise of monotheism, we see something different. Monotheism, of course, currently dominates religious expressions of the contemporary world. With monotheism came the innate connection of the one sole God with the powers of judgment and of the enforcement of morality. Again, a new idea, something that we would have never seen in the ancient world, as well as the consequent notion that the world of the dead would be a sorting out space rather than a continuation of life on earth. To the Greeks, the Egyptians, and many ancient societies, the idea of an afterlife was either a continuation of this one or some kind of cosmic waiting room where your soul kind of went and it's just there. There's no paradise, there's no hell, it just sort of exists. The Sumerian cave of dust, all of these ideas. It's really only when we get into monotheism that we see this idea that you're going to have some kind of award in the afterlife, some kind of paradise, and possibly a stick in the form of some kind of hell. These ideas come from Zoroastrianism, but they will be adopted by Christianity and other monotheistic religions. Christianity has a huge influence on how the faithful, the Christian faithful, will look at the human form. And it's a very different way of looking at the human form than the Greek and Roman world, for example. There's a sense of shame and something very different from the classical. The image that you see here puts the nude fundamentally center stage, but with a very strong Christian moral purpose. Here we see the only two people that you can regularly see nude in Christian art, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They're very simplistically drawn, although there's something wonderfully visceral and almost intestine-like about the external view of their bodies. Adam is pointing to Eve. He's reaching over and taking the apple from the who is reaching over and taking the apple from the winged serpent, wrapped around the tree that we can see just on the right. Later on in another panel, we see them hiding their nakedness. And suddenly, nudity is no longer an expression of human ideals and beauty and perfection, but rather has become an expression of sin. Why? Well, the Bible makes itself quite clear. Once the apple has been eaten and the eyes of both of them have been opened, they discover that they are naked. And you sit there and you go, well, so? But here's the difference. They were nude, now they are naked. And there's a difference. It is a question of intention. Naked is unintentional. Naked is embarrassing. Naked is someone walking in who isn't supposed to see your body in that way. Nude is intentional. Nude is a picture that you send to someone. And by the way, the same image can be both naked and nude depending on the viewer. So if you intended that person to see it, then it's nude. If, however, that picture falls into the wrong hands, now it's naked. Naked has a sense of shame. Nude has a sense of purpose. But moving back to the painting, then Adam says to God, I was afraid because I was naked. I hid myself. But why does Judaism and subsequently Christianity take this view? It's somewhat puzzling. That the nude is so greatly celebrated and admired in the art of Greece and Rome, and now it's suddenly cloaked in a cloud of shame that we've never really shaken off. And this will continue through the medieval period. The church, especially during the Byzantine, will start to destroy images. The church insisted on removing images from public view because it was considered that in the Christian church, nudity was evil. Nudity was, in many ways, the work of the devil. And that changes things dramatically. We're no longer celebrating perfect human forms. Humanity is now shameful, whereas the Greeks and the Romans would have bathed nude in full view of everyone else. The medieval Christians would have been the kinds of people who wore bathing suits into the showers. They're ashamed of the very body that God gave them. And even though they have the same concept as the Greeks and the Romans, that God or the gods, the divine, let's go with the divine, created this form in their likeness, one finds shame and the other finds beauty. Kind of an interesting idea. And it brings us to our first piece, this Byzantine Virgin and Child. Now, this piece is a 6th century encaustic icon. The painter selectively used the classicized style inherited from Rome. What does that mean? What it means is when you look at the painting, the figures appear three-dimensional. They've been modeled. They've been made to look as if they are real. Of course, we know it's an illusion. It's a two-dimensional space, but the illusion is there nonetheless. The faces themselves are modeled, and we see the same convincing modeling in the heads of the angels, and the ease with which the heads turn almost 3/4. And when you look at that modeling, it looks, it's not as realistic as many of the things that we have seen in the past or that we will see in the future, art from the Renaissance and other periods. But it is significant. The Virgin here averts her gaze and does not make eye contact with the viewer. Now, this is interesting. Look at the form of the Virgin. Why cover this form? After all, when you look at the form of the Virgin, she has taken on an air of furniture. Suddenly, she is this big bulk of blue fabric with feet, hands, and head, covering any motherly or feminine form. And they're doing this because of a fear of sin, both sin of the mind, in other words, people will look upon it and get the wrong idea if they show any kind of feminine characteristics, but also a concern that the work could lead to idolatry. If you make her look too realistic and, heaven forbid, too feminine, people will start to pray to it and not through it, and that becomes idolatry. Therefore, Mary has become furniture, a pragmatic necessity, a vessel, not a mother. After 1400, with the waning of the Middle Ages, artists begin depicting nudes as increasingly three-dimensional, vibrant, and lifelike. They employed diverse means. In Italy, through return to the models of ancient Greece and Rome, and in Northern Europe, through refinements to the technique of painting in oils that enabled painters to capture textures with unprecedented truth to nature. In concert with new scientific approaches, artists across Europe studied nature, including the human body, with increasing specificity and deliberation. The meaningful depiction of the human form became the highest aspiration for artists, and their efforts often resulted in figures of notable sensuality. For Christians, however, who represented most of European society at the time, the nude body could be disturbing and arouse personal desires. Their conflicted responses are mirrored in our own body-obsessed era, filled with images of nudity and yet pronounced prudishness. Art played a key role in Catholic worship and instruction, on church walls and facades, on altars, and in liturgical and devotional books. Jesus resides at the heart of this imagery. His body was shown as mostly unclothed, in this case revealing the signs of his physical persecution and crucifixion. Similarly, imagery of the nude or mostly unclothed bodies of saints and of biblical heroes and heroines functioned in religious observance and private devotion, often representing, often graphically, their torture and martyrdom. Despite a rise in the depiction of secular subjects, encouraged by renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman art, Christian subjects continued to dominate artistic production throughout the Renaissance. And of course, we cannot deal with the human form through the frame of faith without touching on David, perhaps the most famous sculpture of Renaissance Italy. He's proportionate. He is harmonious. He's beautiful. There's a calm, but also a certain inner strength. He stands outside, or originally stood outside, Palazzo Vecchio. This was the seat of Florentine government, and he's there as a symbol of the city itself. He's become a symbol of many things, of Michelangelo's prowess, but also of male beauty. We may think of David as a classical sculpture because its proportions, in many ways, are classical. But in many ways, it's also starkly modern. Many classical sculptures have a slightly solemn aspect and a sense of introversion. They look in at themselves. David, on the other hand, looks straight out at the viewer. David is a statue which is almost belligerently proud of its nakedness. It challenges the viewer with both sheer bravado, but also at times deliberately erotic. After all, this is the David. This is the story of a young boy who goes out to defeat Goliath, and he's built like a model. This is a muscular form that does not match the young boy of biblical accounts. Michelangelo must have a reason for it, and that's where we tend to read into that element of eroticism that comes into the David. Man was now seen as the most beautiful thing in the universe. Man created in the image of God, man perfected, man in the Greek sense. Perfected because he is created in the image of God. And therefore the artist owes it to God to create the perfect form, or as perfect as humanly possible. We cannot look at the human form in the Renaissance without dealing with the Sistine Chapel. At the turn of the 16th century, Pope Julius II had decided to have the chapel, as well as the rest of the Vatican, decorated. As a result, Michelangelo painted episodes from Genesis and the creation. When finally the work was unveiled, the nude loomed large. Young, naked, and arguably eroticized men are everywhere, surrounding the very moment of creation itself. To Michelangelo, the male body, made in God's image, represents the summit of physical and spiritual beauty. Flat backgrounds lack great perspective, as Michelangelo focused solely on the figure and on the narrative. Here, the great artist works with a frenzied whirlwind of energy toward a freedom from convention. And of course, the most famous image here is the creation of Adam. This is not a traditional representation. Rather, it's a very humanist view. This is God in humanism. And in the humanist view, from the humanist perspective, the role of God is not creating the biological form. It is not that straightforward. Instead, they look at man and they look at the animals and they say, well, what is the difference between the two? What separates me from any other creature? And the answer is rational thought. To the humanists, the gift from God is not the creation of the physical form, but the presence of rational thought, the gift of rational thought. And that's what we see here in the creation of Adam. Adam here is heavy. He's a piece of the earth until the touch of God gives him freedom. Here, Adam is nothing more than an animal until he is given rational thought. God is presented in the guise of a muscular Greek hero, a classical sculpture brought to life, who in turn brings life to the universe. Beneath God's left arm is Eve, curious but not yet created. God's left hand points to the Christ child. The shell, or cloth, is a foreshadowing device. What is it foreshadowing? It's foreshadowing original sin, and consequently, the crucifixion and the coming of Jesus. Because with the creation of Adam, you must have the creation of Eve. With the creation of Eve, you must have original sin. With original sin, you must have the crucifixion. Yes, there's some jumps in there. But according to Christian teaching, one must lead to the other. This becomes the ultimate visual representation of human potential. Michelangelo, as a Neoplatonist, believed that God gave free will. In fact, a year after his death in 1565, the Vatican repainted some scenes from the ceiling because they felt that they might be too risque. Michelangelo did, however, set a trend in which artists keen to show off their skills chose Christian subjects in which they could show nudity without fear of retribution, and indeed often celebrate sexuality and flesh effectively for the first time since antiquity. It's really Michelangelo that opens that door, that welcomes artists in and draws artists to certain scenes. Because in those scenes, they can really start to understand the potential of the human form and the perfection of the human form. And so we're going to see that push towards religious imagery that shows something very, very different from what the teachings are giving us. The teachings may be prudish, but the paintings are far from it. Nudity, even of Christ, could be acceptable, as seen on numerous depictions of the crucifix. As religious reform gathered steam, nudity in art, once generally accepted, became a hotly debated topic. And this happens around the Reformation and the subsequent Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation is a term defining the Catholic Church's generally conservative reaction to the Reformation of Martin Luther. It formally began with the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563, which hardened the lines of doctrine, revised the liturgy, and laid down new rules for religious music and art. Michelangelo's Last Judgement reflected something of this new mood, not enough, however, to satisfy more literal-minded reformers. So let's look at that Last Judgement. This is done in the Sistine Chapel by exactly the same artist who did the ceiling that we just looked at moments ago, and yet you're going to see a very different sense of what is Christian and how Christians really come to understand the human form. Michelangelo labored relentlessly on the fresco from 1536 to 1541. By any reckoning, it's an astonishing achievement, but all the more so for being the work of a man well into his 60s. As he's done before, Michelangelo uses color with incredible subtlety. But the style of the painting is far more brutal. Its mood is harsher, and its impact far more disturbing. Christ isn't serenely enthroned at the center. Instead, he's a young, muscular man of action, surrounded by a naked, seething mass of humanity. To the left, we see Mary, not praying for the sinners, but cowering from them. The nude figures themselves gave offense. Nudity in art was seen at this time, in the same lifetime as the man who painted the ceiling above them. They see nudity as indecent. Its antique precedence being pagan and its Neoplatonic justification heretical. The Christian humanism which had inspired the Sistine Chapel ceiling was now seen as a hotbed of Protestantism, as pretty much everything that wasn't agreeable to the conservative side of the church was. So it became a label that they attached to things that they really didn't like. By 1549, he was denounced as an inventor of filthiness who cared more for art than for devotion. In particular, his Last Judgement was declared obscene and 41 nudes painted over. And here the nude actually played a role, a very specific role. In the Last Judgement, nudity is there not to show the potential of man as we see in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but rather to show that man can hide nothing from God in that time of the Last Judgement. And here we see a depiction of figures painted over. Now, we know mostly about this today because of restoration that happened in the 1990s, where many of these garments and fig leaves and pieces of cloth were removed to bring back the original image. Following in the footsteps of Michelangelo, we of course see Caravaggio. Now, much to the horror of his critics, Caravaggio is known for using ordinary working people with irregular, rough, and character-rich faces as models for his saints, and showed them in recognizably contemporary surroundings. This is upsetting in the light of Protestant ideals, such as allowing the Bible to be written in the vernacular, or allowing for humans to commune directly with God without the need of a priestly mediator. This allows the common man to see themselves in the place of the saints, and it makes Caravaggio's work far more relatable. After all, you're going to look at and see yourself in an image when it seems like you might be looking back at yourself, or you could place yourself in that position. You identify with the body form, with the person, with the characteristics that you see in the painting. But some fear that this relatability, since it could lead people to take the biblical figures off their plinth, that becomes a huge issue. If it's too relatable, if Jesus himself is too relatable, then you won't put him in his ivory tower. You won't hold him with the same element of respect. And then what's going to happen? And this brings us to Caravaggio's Entombment. Fundamentally, this is a Renaissance composition, grandiose and compact. The body of Jesus seems to have a genuine pathos with the rough hands and feet. While the physical form is far from heroic, the pose is that of Jesus in Michelangelo's Pietà. The work has all the characteristics of Caravaggio: plebeian figures, dramatic light, and the invitation for the viewer to participate in the scene. The corner of the slab invades the viewer's space, suggesting that the body is about to be lain at the viewer's feet. But there's more to that. The work is actually set behind an altar, giving the impression that the body is being laid on the altar, giving visual form to the idea of transubstantiation, which is the bread and wine becoming, miraculously, the body and blood of Jesus. By depicting the body of Jesus being laid on the altar, he is creating the illusion of the Eucharist, or alluding to the Eucharist. Here, the artist is articulating an abstract theological precept through the rough-hewn frame of a common man, beckoning us into the work to take a role as we see fit, as mourner, as conveyor of the body, or perhaps, as heretical as it may seem, as Jesus himself. By using these plain, simple, plebeian figures, Caravaggio has invited us into the space, has asked us to participate and place ourselves in these different positions. What would I do if I were there as a witness? To conclude, let's look at some of those questions that I asked at the beginning. So, why do we depict ourselves so regularly in images of our faith? As humans, we tend to create ideas of God in our likeness, so it only follows that in religion, we focus on the human experience. Even if we could imagine an abstract creator form on an intellectual level, how would you ever depict such a being, such that it communicates all the ideas inherent in the conception of deity? You probably can't. Therefore, out of pragmatism, we focus on the human form to better communicate the stories, metaphors, and allegories on which religion rests. You must use an image which is going to be relatable to your audience. If we create a religion where all figures were depicted as squirrels, we could not actually relate to it. So we must use depictions of ourselves for simply that idea of relatability. Next, how has faith informed how we see ourselves? As we have seen, faith often informs behavior. There are prescribed rituals and standards of, for example, cleanliness that must be kept. These interact with our understandings of ourselves. To the religious faith is ubiquitous throughout life, so it only stands to reason that the concepts of one's faith impact the way that they imagine themselves and the societal mores of their culture. In other words, when we see the human form depicted in art, the artist, whether they intend to or not, will also depict the mores, the concepts of one's faith as they relate to the body. So when the body becomes an element of promise, of future, of development, when we're dealing with the humanist idea of nudity in art, reflecting the potential of man, well, Michelangelo depicts nude men, and we get that idea, the potential of man. When, however, society very quickly reverses and says, you know what? Nudity is not the potential of man. It is shameful. It is wrong. Michelangelo changes the way that he depicts the human form once again, giving it a sense of beauty as well as shame. So, religion and depictions of the human body in religious context really does inform how we see ourselves, how we interact as a society. And finally, how do these religious images reflect the faith and societies that created them? Well, the art simply reflects the ideas and beliefs of the society that creates it. If it didn't, then the art would become an outlier and is unlikely to be discussed in the canon of art history. To be successful, any piece of art must speak to the society which created it. If you do not speak to the society that creates it, then at the end of the day, you become an outlier. And as an outlier, auction houses, scholars, art galleries, etc. are going to lose interest rapidly. They're not going to be interested in those things that do not relate to and do not speak to the society that creates them. Therefore, the art that makes it into the art historical canon must speak to the society that created it. It must be reflection, which means Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, Caravaggio's Entombment, these must reflect ideas of their society at the time, be it relatability, be it potential, be it the classical form of the David. Whenever we look at these images, they reflect something about the society that created them, not just the artist, because the artist didn't get to be great if he wasn't reflecting the society in the first place. So, hopefully this gives you an idea of how the human body and Western faith have interacted throughout the millennia, both in the classical world and in the more modern monotheistic Christian world.